Hello, y'all. So this is going to be our second lecture for Module 1. If you're following along in the PowerPoint slides, we're looking at feminism as a worldview, as a theory, and as a movement. I think when you read the Bell Hooks articles on feminism, I think that it's pretty self-explanatory, but there are some key points that I want to draw your attention to that are highlighted in the PowerPoint slides. So the first one says feminism as a worldview. So earlier on from chapter 1, we talked about things like essentialism, minimalism, maximalism, androcentrism, all of these types of things. And those are worldviews, or just kind of our way of understanding things and making sense of things. Feminism as a worldview really focuses on equality and inclusion. It's not focused on one group having power over another. It's focused on collaboration, power with other people. And this is an area where I think there are a lot of misconceptions about feminism. It's not about promoting women over men or making women somehow more powerful than men. Feminism really as a worldview is just looking at equality. Another thing that's interesting about feminism is that it's not just concerned with gender and biological sex. It's concerned with things like sexual orientation. It's concerned with things like gender identity, race and ethnicity, social class. So it is looking to take those dominance hierarchies that I spoke about in the last lecture, and it's about making all of those levels equal so that one group does not have power over another. So make sure you understand that as a distinction. Now, when we talk about feminism as a worldview, there are some questions that come from a feminist perspective that are useful to ask yourself. Whenever you're thinking about any structure in the culture, any system, any institution, any tradition or cultural practice or norm, it's helpful if you ask these three questions. Who benefits from this system or this institution or whatever it is we're talking about? Who holds the power in this situation? And how was the power obtained? So in the PowerPoint slides, I've given you a couple of examples. One of those is this tradition that we had in our culture for a while that women should be stay-at-home mothers. Okay, so if we just take that belief, or we could say that family structure, from a feminist perspective, we want to ask the question, who benefits from women being stay-at-home mothers? Okay, so you can think about your own answers to that. When you've answered that, ask yourself the question, who holds the power in that type of family structure? Okay. And then you can ask yourself, okay, how do they obtain that power? How do they get that power? So I just encourage you to think about those kinds of questions. You can draw your own conclusions from those, but feminism is very much about answering those kinds of questions when we're talking about any sort of power structure or system or institution in the culture. Now, feminism is different from patriarchy. You're going to be reading an article entitled Patriarchy, the System. I think that's the name of it. And we need to think about patriarchy as a systemic process or practice within the culture. Patriarchy simply means male dominance. Okay, it means that in various systems and structures within the culture, males are going to have privilege within those systems and structures. Now, patriarchy's been around for thousands of years. Some scientists, some social scientists link it back to the introduction of agriculture in our world. Prior to agriculture, we had hunter-gatherers. And contrary to popular belief, women also hunted and men also gathered. So that was not where we saw a gender breakdown. We started to see gender breakdowns, gender disparities whenever we introduced agriculture into our way of life. And again, that was around 10,000 years ago. Since that time, we have seen different forms of patriarchal systems and structures come into place. And in spite of us being in 2022, in spite of us living in the United States, we still live within a patriarchal or male dominant system. You'll see from the slides that patriarchies can be defined as dualistic, meaning it's one group versus another group. It also includes hierarchy, so that's where that dominance hierarchy system comes into place, is because we live in a patriarchy, and it's competitive. So it sets groups up to try to obtain more power for one than for another. That comes directly from patriarchy. Some other things that have emerged in our culture is that a patriarchal system values logic and reason over emotion. Okay, so again, we've sort of attributed those characteristics to different sexes. We say that men are logical and reasonable. We say that women are emotional. More on that later in the semester. The other thing that you have to remember about patriarchy is that this is not, it's not a group of men that get together and say, let's overtake the system and let's, oppress women. That's not at all how it functions. However, in a patriarchal system, the people that tend to benefit from that are men. And in the United States, for example, when you add to that race and ethnicity, we're going to put white men as those in power. And when you add social class, we're going to put wealth above middle class and lower class and poor, right? So those individuals that have the most power in the United States patriarchal system would be wealthy white men of a particular age. Okay, again, more on that later. So when you read bell hooks, I've got some slides here that just give you some points to think about in regard to her writings. And you can go through those. Just make sure as you're going through the slides that you feel that you can answer those questions that I've posed from the readings. So that's feminism as a worldview, but then we move into feminism as a theory. Later on, we're going to be talking about chapter 5, which are some specific theories related to gender development. We can also think of feminism as a theory that relates to gender development. However, when we talk about feminist theory, that is another umbrella term because there are actually dozens of different feminist theories. We're only going to be looking at 4 of those. So keep in mind that there are distinct differences between them. And as we're going through these, you can think about which ones you tend to relate to more than others. So the first is liberal feminism. And this is probably the feminism that we most associate with the women's rights movement in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Liberal feminism is all about equality. It's all about focusing on legal rights, economic rights, reproductive rights. And the goal really is to make people equal. Liberal feminism is also more of an individualistic rather than a systemic theory. What that means is that individual people are going to make choices. They're going to engage in certain actions and behaviors in an attempt to gain their own equality or create more equal circumstances for other people. The concern here is about ending oppression and ending inequality. So that's liberal feminism in a nutshell. Then we have radical feminism. Now, radical feminism is, it represents a pretty small percentage of feminist theory and of true actual feminists in the world. But when we think about feminism or people that are against feminism, oftentimes the caricature that they hold in their mind is of a radical feminist. Now, radical feminism is more systemic than individualistic. Radical feminism says we need to get rid of the patriarchy. We need to create whole new systems and structures within our culture. Radical feminism is the one that includes race and social class. Those are kind of melded together in radical feminism. And as I said, this kind of holds as the stereotype for all of feminism when it only represents a small percentage. But I would say that radical feminists very oftentimes are anti-male, and they do look for a world where men are not necessarily present. It's a much more radical approach. Then we have cultural feminism. Now, cultural feminism, it says that, listen, we recognize that women and men are not the same. We recognize that there are some natural differences between women and men, but the way women are should be just as valued as the way men are. So it's a little bit different from liberal feminism, because liberal feminism says really there aren't many significant differences. Women and men are just not that different, and therefore they need to be held equally. Cultural feminism says, there are some important differences, but we still value equality. And it looks to really celebrate the differences. So one of the differences that you might see coming from a cultural feminist perspective is what's called an ethic of care, or a value of care. And that is associating relationship and emotional expression and empathy and compassion with females, with femininity. And it says that is just as important as what men bring to the table. So that's cultural feminism. And actually, we have seen over the last probably 10 to 20 years, we have seen some religious groups, some Christian women, for example, come out as cultural feminists as a way of preserving that difference that they see inherent between women and men. Then the fourth type of feminism we're going to talk about that's not really addressed much in your text is post-feminism. Post-feminism is really kind of the modern feminism of today. And it basically says, listen, we have transcended the need for liberal feminism that was present in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We've moved on to a more modern type of feminism that says women and men are already equal. They're already equal. We don't have to fight for that anymore. It says that women actually gain power through their own individual choice. So post-feminism is individualistic in that way, that we are going to support women regardless of what their choice is. So for example, Beyonce is a modern idol that is held up as a post-feminist today. And one of the reasons for that is that she has used her sexuality as a way to gain power. That is viewed as a very post-feminist type of approach. Another example is in the 60s and 70s and 80s, a lot of liberal feminists said prostitution and pornography are bad. They are harmful to women. They are oppressive of women, and we want to rescue women out of those environments and out of those institutions. A post-feminist, on the other hand, would say, listen, if this is how a woman gains power, if this is how she gains economic power, individual power, reproductive power, then we want to be supportive of sex workers, whatever form that takes. And we even want to legalize that so it can be more closely regulated to protect women. So it is supportive of women's choices. Likewise, if a woman says, you know what, I want to marry, I want to stay at home and raise my children, I really want to focus on that aspect of marriage, a post-feminist would say, fantastic. As long as you're not feeling coerced into doing that, as long as it is not harmful to you in any way, including economically, we support your right to do so. So it's a much more modern approach. Okay, so make sure you read those points on post-feminism so that you understand it. Another concept that has come from post-feminism is the concept of intersectionality. Some of you may have heard this from other classes, but intersectionality is basically the idea that each of us has multiple different identities. So this is going to come up in I believe it's your first discussion board for this module. And it basically says that as a woman, I am not just one thing. Not all women are the same, and not all women have the same experiences. So for example, I am a white, middle class, heterosexual, cisgender female, okay? Those multiple identities give me different levels of privilege, different levels of power, and also some different experiences of oppression. So my experience is probably going to look different from a poor Latina transgender female. Okay? Pretty easy to see how those different identities come together collectively to create a different lived experience. I've included in the PowerPoint slides a link. It says it's called Intersectionality Explained, and this will just take you to a very quick video link that will help explain that in a little bit more detail. So that's feminist theory. Some of the information is from chapter 1, some of it is from the additional articles by Bell Hooks, and some of it I've added in the PowerPoint slides. Then we have feminism as a movement. Okay, so remember, we've got feminism as a worldview, feminism as a theory, and now feminism as a movement. And this is a very unique aspect in feminist theory, is that it requires action. It requires putting the theory, putting the worldview into practice. Other theories do not necessarily call for that. So feminism as a movement. So far, to the present day, we've had, some people say, up to 4 waves of feminism. And those began in the 1700s up to the present day. We're going to go through each of those waves. Excuse me. In each of those time periods in history, there has been different involvement by different groups of people. In the first wave, we're talking about the 1700s and 1800s into the early 1900s. And first wave feminism was primarily concerned with women's suffrage. Women's suffrage is the right that women have to vote. And so you may or may not know, but when this country was founded, women were not viewed as the same level as men. We were deemed as second-class citizens. It was thought that women were not intelligent enough to be involved in government or politics. Also, women at that time just didn't have a lot of power. So women didn't have the vote whenever this country was founded. We were not allowed to vote. You can see on the slide some of these women that were very active during the first wave and some of the accomplishments that they had. Men were also involved in first wave feminism, but not in great numbers, but there were men involved in that. When you look at the PowerPoint slide, what do all 3 of those women have in common? They're white. So first wave feminism was really for white women, and it was for middle and upper class women primarily. That's who was involved, and that's who had the most power during that first wave of feminism. So women get the right to vote in 1919 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And then we have not really so much of a wave. There were individual actions that women would take to try to gain a bit more power in the culture. One of those happened in the 1920s with, you may have seen the flappers from 1920s. These were women who defied the cultural norms at the time by cutting their hair short, by wearing shorter dresses, by wearing high heels, by showing off their legs and their arms. This was really unheard of until the 1920s. And so this was a way that women were sort of deciding for themselves how they wanted to exist in the culture. We're going to go into much greater detail about this later on when we talk about marriage and the family. But let's go ahead now and shift to second wave feminism. This really happened in the 1960s and 70s. This was the women's rights movement of the time that some of you may be familiar with. And it was during this time that liberal feminism, radical feminism, and cultural feminism really came to the forefront. You see here again different individuals that were well known during that time: Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, and then we have Bell Hooks. This is a pretty old picture of her in her youth when she began a lot of her activity. Now, during second wave feminism, the feminist movement was pretty fractured along different lines. First of all, there were some men involved during this time, but it was primarily a movement led by women. It was primarily a movement led by white women. And so women of color during this time, some of them split off from the women's rights groups of the time because they did not feel like issues that addressed them specifically as women of color were being included in the platform of the women's movement. So we had women of color sort of in and out of this movement. We also had a fracturing here too along the lines of sexual orientation. Lesbians also felt like the women's rights movement was not inclusive enough of different sexual orientations. And so many of them would split off from time to time and work on the LGBT movement. At that time, queer was not a term that was used at that time, but we saw women break off from the women's rights movement during that time. So it was a little bit messy. There was a lot going on during this time, primarily looking at reproductive rights, economic rights, and some other legal rights that women were fighting for. Again, we're going to go into much more detail about this later on. Then we have the third wave. Third wave was, some people say, late 80s into the 90s, into the 2000s. And this is where we started to see the rise of post-feminism and that issue of intersectionality. There was also in the third wave a focus on rape culture. So later in the semester, we're going to be looking at things like the male gaze, sexual objectification, rape culture, and that really was born out of the third wave of the feminist movement. Again, you see here some white women, some women of color who were very active and involved during post-feminism, the third wave. And some people say we're still in the third wave, that it's still growing and expanding. Others say that we're actually into a different phase that began in the 2000s called the fourth wave. And what distinguishes the fourth wave from these other waves is the focus on digital media, the power of the internet, the power of social media for activism is unlike anything we've seen prior, just because we didn't have the technology prior. So many scholars are now saying, no, we are actively living within this fourth wave of feminism. One of the movements of the fourth wave is the Me Too movement. Some of you have probably heard of that. Some of you may be unfamiliar. The Me Too movement, it's hashtag Me Too, and it actually began a while ago, but it was really brought to the forefront, I believe, in 2016, 2017. And it was this movement of primarily women, but also some male victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault that were coming out on social media saying, this happened to me. And then others would share their stories and include the hashtag Me Too. And it was a movement to bring down powerful men who had raped and sexually harassed other people, males and females both. So that's been a big part of the fourth wave. The fourth wave is also very inclusive of different sexual orientations, different races and ethnicities, different abilities, and it is sex positive, it is trans positive, and it is body positive. So it's probably the most inclusive wave of feminism that we have seen yet, and it is still growing. We'll see what all comes out of that. So those are our 4 waves of feminism. And then if you look at the PowerPoint slides, it says at the top, "Is that legal?" AKA, "Thank you, feminists." So these are things that we often take for granted now, that women have a legal right to do. And the reason that we have a legal right to engage in these things is because feminists fought for these things. So just some examples from the first slide. You could buy birth control if you were single beginning in 1972-73. Prior to that, the pill was around, but you could not buy it unless you were a married woman, and you had to have your husband's permission. Some other things: keep your job if you become pregnant. Prior to 1978, if a woman was working outside of the home and she became pregnant, her boss could fire her for cause, just because she was pregnant. If you skip to the next slide, you'll see divorce her husband if she wants to. Prior to 1969, she had to prove, I believe it was adultery, she had to prove that in order to be granted a divorce from her husband. But after 1969, a woman could divorce her husband for whatever reason she chose. And then I have on here, have a legal abortion. Roe v. Wade legalized abortion. It gave women a constitutional right based on the 14th Amendment, giving women a right to privacy to their own bodies. That was legalized in 1973. We are living through history right now, because on June 24th of this year, Roe v. Wade was overturned. This does not make abortion illegal. It just puts the legality of abortion back on the states. And the court says that the right to an abortion is not given in the Constitution, therefore it cannot be upheld as a legal reproductive right. So this is going back to the states. In the state of Texas, abortion will now be illegal. More on that as we get into marriage and family. So then the next slide you'll see is entitled Patriarchy, the System. This article is written by Alan Johnson. Pay attention to that. It's written by a man, and he writes about the characteristics that make up a patriarchy. Now, you will find that this is pretty dense reading material. I know that it can be difficult reading. Please do your best with it. It is a very, very important article. It's very important in terms of understanding feminism, understanding feminist theory, understanding why our systems and structures are in place the way that they are. And then on the next slide, I have some questions there that you need to be thinking about. Compare this reading to what you read from Bell Hooks and what you read in the textbook about feminism, and see how a patriarchy compares to that. Of specific note is this concept in the reading called the path of least resistance. Alan Johnson explains in great detail what a patriarchal system looks like, how it behaves, what types of structures and systems are in place. And it says the way that we continue perpetuating a patriarchy is through the path of least resistance. So be thinking about that. If you aren't sure you understand it, please reach out to me and let me know. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about this reading. Again, it's very dense and I could lecture on it for hours. But the path of least resistance is this idea that we don't want to do anything or say anything that's going to make us uncomfortable in a social situation. So an example of this, let's say you have a young man and he's hanging out with his buddies, and let's say his buddies start telling a rape joke. We may have heard those in the past. They're pervasive in the culture. Let's say he hears his buddies making a rape joke. or even talking about a female that has been taken advantage of, that's been assaulted at a party, for example. And let's say the guys are all kind of laughing about it and saying common things that we might hear young men say. And let's say you have a couple of men in that group that are really uneasy about what they're hearing. They don't think it's funny. They don't agree with it. They see that it's sexual assault, but they stay quiet. Why do they stay quiet? That is the path of least resistance. And that's how a male-dominated society perpetuates itself, is by being unchallenged. Feminism is a tool to challenge patriarchy and to come up against some of these different systems and structures that are in place. So again, there's a lot of information in these articles and in the readings. This is an area where I expect you to be really challenged. Some of you may already identify as feminists. Many of you may agree with all of these principles, but you haven't claimed the label of feminist. And for some of you, this may be counter to things that you've grown up believing in. This is where the challenge exists. This is where the struggle exists. And I encourage you to stick with these articles and put on a feminist hat and try to imagine the world from that perspective. Think about how these statements and these articles touch you personally. Think about how they touch people in your life, people that you know, male and female. And one of the things to keep in mind as well, patriarchy is not just oppressive to females. Patriarchy is also damaging to males. Think about reasons why that might be true. Think about why it might be damaging or harmful for a man to exist within a patriarchy. So that is the second lecture for this module. That gets us through week 1. And for week 2, I will have some more lectures to go through some information quickly.